terminal living. I was beginning to understand, in layman's terms, that Brian's problem was that he was producing too many immature white blood cells. These blasts, to give them their proper title, were of no use to him, and they were crowding out his red cells. This was, essentially, why he was going to die prematurely. His body was making no attempt to reverse that trend, and chemo would only give him so many chances at recovery. His cell count, the percentage of leukemia or immature cells, might be 92% one day, but then a course of chemo might knock it back to 75% the next day. The chemo was having some good effect this time around. This latest session had knocked back the number of immature white cells. Blood transfusions had replaced them with working cells, and Brian was a bit stronger. He had made quite a good recovery following his severe throat infection. John refused to give up. "They're still trying. The next chemo might work," he said with hope in his heart. "I know Brian is critically ill," I said to Dr. Cotter. "I know he could die at any moment, but what is the best scenario?" "Weeks rather than months," she said. When I told John this, he said, "But that's only if the chemo doesn't work." The next day, I approached Sue, another doctor on the team. "We're hearing different stories," I said to her. "I keep hearing that he's going to die, and John still believes that there's a chance. Why don't you both come in together?" she said. "Us coming in together to you won't change anything," I said. "We just interpret the information differently. We both understand maths. Can you give me a figure for Brian's chance of survival? 40%? 30%? "Less than 1%, she replied. There it was. Less than 1%. There was no trying to reinterpret that. Brian's body was still producing large numbers of blasts. Treatments could kill those off, but he was never going to recover, since he was not manufacturing any of the right cells. It is the human dilemma to have difficulty discerning what the truth is against what we wish was true. It's really difficult trying to assimilate this fact when people were saying, "You must stay positive. Brian won't die. Don't worry." I was quite annoyed by this well-meaning, "you have to stay positive" stuff that people said to me. It implied that if I was positive enough, my child would live. I knew now that he couldn't and wouldn't. It was a terrible weight to put on my shoulders, that if only I was positive enough, I could turn this thing around. I now understood that, in a way, this whole journey had nothing to do with me. Whether Brian lived or died, I had no say in that. It would have been easier for me if people had said something like, "Be present. Enjoy your time with Brian. We'll think of you and pray for you." I've learned from that experience to say less to people. In fact, I just usually say I'm sorry. And if I spend a long time with them, perhaps I repeat, "I'm so very sorry," and leave it at that. I don't even say what I'm sorry about, as I don't know where someone is at. It could mean, "Sorry the child is sick," "Sorry you're so upset," or "Sorry he's dying," or all of them. Being sorry, I've realised, will fit any of the many different spaces one occupies during difficult times. Brian had such incredible friends. Young people today are just so terrific. Youngsters call to the house and they call to the hospital, gangs of them. They were so attentive. I can name Patrick, 2 Johns, Noel, James, Declan and Tom as the regulars who were at his beck and call during all his illness, visiting when he was well and fretting when they had to stay away because he was too sick for visitors. One occasion that stands out in my mind was when one of his friends called to the house to visit Brian. I couldn't help crying when I was explaining that I had just brought him into the hospital earlier and he was dying, that I had just come home for night clothes. I remember this little young lad putting his arms around me without saying a word. I really wish our young lads were more appreciated. When Brian's friends were with him in the hospital, I would take a break. I might come home, have a shower, change my clothes. He'd phone when his friends were ready to leave. As I went to and fro from the hospital, I often heard Celine Dion singing "Think Twice" on the radio, and I was really moved. Look back before you leave my life. Be sure before you close that door. I too wanted to ask Brian not to leave me, not to do what he was about to do, to tell him that my everything depended on him. She put words in my feelings. I knew, however, that it was not up to me, or indeed Brian for that matter. Life had its own agenda. Having been anointed in mid-April, followed by that horrendous throat infection, Brian was now having about 3 relatively good weeks around the beginning of May. By this, I mean he could walk a little with the help of the anaesthetic tablets. He was allowed home from hospital. On those Saturday nights we'd bring him as far as the door of his favourite pub, from where he could manage the few steps to a table inside. He would phone us a little while later to collect him, and he would manage the few steps to the car outside the door. What a blessing the mobile phone was in the circumstances that Brian found himself. His friends could phone him any time, and if he was well enough he would see them. But he wouldn't let them see him if he wasn't well. He wore long-sleeved T-shirts if his arms had black and blue patches from the low platelet count, so they would not be upset at the sight of them. When Brian was in hospital, his medications were included in the cost, and we had medical insurance to cover the bills. But when he came home, we had to pay for his medications and the doctor's home visits. We didn't have a medical card, which would have entitled him to free medications which were costing at least €100 per day. So I asked the nurse if she could, perhaps, give him some of his pain medication for his use at home in order to help reduce our costs. While she was considerate and gentle in her response, what she ended up saying was, "He's terminal, so he's entitled to a medical card." How could I process that sentence? It was certainly good news that Brian was entitled to a medical card, but her words felt like a punch in the gut, since at that moment I wasn't thinking about him dying. I was thinking about him living at home. I phoned the relevant health service executive department, and a really caring staff member sorted out an emergency medical card for me as quickly as she could. It meant that we didn't have to pay for medications anymore, which was a bit of good news. However, it was the first time I saw it in writing, the Brian O'Mahony terminal illness statement that I needed to produce to get Brian's medical card. What was I supposed to do with that sentence? Where in my brain was I supposed to park that fact? We have such wonderful neighbours. Maureen and her family have lived next door since we moved into our house. They'd moved in only weeks before us. Neither Maureen nor I had any family living close by to call upon, so we always shared and helped each other out. Brenda lives 3 doors down. At Easter, when we were full-time in the hospital with Brian, both Maureen and Brenda came in and cleaned our house. On the evenings when I would get home from the hospital, neighbours, on seeing my car, would phone or call to inquire about Brian. That was another change in my life. People were constantly tracking me. I live in a lovely neighbourhood where there's freedom to do your own thing. Now, however, I knew there was a watch on the family members and even friends, so inquiries could be made for an update. It felt very supportive on one level, but on another level, I felt like I was in some kind of a reality show, a very new experience for me. One evening I needed to rest so badly, having had no sleep the previous nights, that Maureen offered me a bed in her house for an hour. This would help me to avoid doorbells and phones. She was so thoughtful. I appreciated Brenda's kindness the night before my birthday in April, when we believed Brian to be sick rather than dying. She organised a little birthday party for me in her house, a few doors away, so I could feel safe in the knowledge that I would be only a few steps from Brian, who was home for the weekend. John Twig would help by cutting our grass. "I know, Brian always cut the grass," he kindly said. John and Anne Lee, our friends, living next door when we first met and still near neighbours, could not have been more understanding. They encouraged me to talk with them about Brian dying. Most people couldn't handle that type of conversation. It was hard to find people who would listen to me speaking of watching my critically ill child lurch from crisis to crisis. They had sons. Their Jim was a day younger than our Brian, and both of them had begun nursery school together. Anne and I had brought our boys to their first day in primary school together. John and Anne prepared me in advance for the fact that, were Brian to die at home, he would be taken out by the funeral directors in a black plastic bag. It was better for me to get used to this image, rather than be shocked by the sight of the black plastic body bag covering my child. They were always really solid friends. Bishop Buckley visited Brian a few times in the hospital. I don't know where he gets the time, but he visits all of his flock in hospital. He is an incredible shepherd. Father Nyan called many times to see Brian when he was at home. He was such a gentleman. To my embarrassment at home, Brian struggled onto his crutches and left the room for Father Nyan to sit down. Usually, visitors of my age group were for me, not him. So Brian didn't seem to take on board that the priest had called to see him in particular, and that was Brian. He just ignored the fact that he was critically ill. Take, for example, the day he got his new chair. Quite early on, when Brian was disabled, I got the idea that a reclining chair would allow him to be in the sitting room when he might otherwise need to lie down in his bed. So when John, his brother, was home for the weekend and needed a new suit for an interview that was part of his college course, I went into Cork City with him to get it. I popped into Casey's furniture shop a couple of doors away from Tom Murphy's clothes shop and bought a chair with a touch control that would recline at the touch of a button. I bought it on a Saturday, a very wet Saturday as I recall, and the shop would not be delivering it until the Monday. But Brian was going back into hospital that Monday, and the hospital staff had told me he was unlikely to live long enough to get out again. So my friends Anne and John got a van and went straight into the shop to collect the chair. Brian, his dad and brothers were all there to help with moving it into the house, and our patio door had to be removed in order to enable them to do so. It cut through me to watch Brian trying to help to negotiate the chair in the door. He couldn't straighten his knees and he was completely bent over, not to mention loaded with painkillers, yet there Brian was, hovering, trying to help. He showed me how to be in this world. He lived. He ignored his pain and disability as much as he could, as if they were a minor inconvenience to his process of living. Going into hospital he was mostly in a wheelchair. Coming out he might be on crutches. Sometimes he could walk. Whichever it was, he never complained. As he said to me once, "God gave this to me." That was his attitude. Brian was home from hospital and had those good weeks, though he was still critically ill. Everything in life was now measured in how many steps, as Brian could only manage a very limited number of them. We tried to keep life as normal as we could, making sure that every event that we organised would only involve a few steps for Brian. A week or so before Brian's 19th birthday, which was coming up on March 18th, we brought him into the city centre to buy new trousers. He needed a smaller size in the waist. His dad dropped us at the door of the department store. The men's clothing section was only just inside the door. We needed trousers to fit this 6-footer, ensuring that it had the smallest waist available with a belt to hold it up. While John went for the car to collect us at the door, Brian's legs were buckling. He sat on the bin outside. I wanted to stop people passing by. I wanted to say, "You think you have problems. You complain about the weather. Look at this young man, he's dying. There isn't a word out of him. If his legs won't hold him up, he'll find something else that will. He just keeps on keeping on. See how he shows us how to live life." But of course, I kept my mouth shut, and John arrived with the car shortly afterwards. Then just a couple of days later, before his birthday, Brian was very low, but still at home. He was barely breathing, and I called the doctor to see if there was anything I should be doing that perhaps I wasn't doing to help. "Are you alone with him?" he inquired as he saw my child collapsed on the bed. "Yes," I answered. He advised that usually in such circumstances a patient would be in a hospice, or at least have a full-time nurse. I explained that I wanted Brian to die at home with no fuss, if that was possible. So we carried on as before. There was nothing the doctor could do to improve Brian's chance of living to see his birthday, or indeed being able to get out of bed that day. When the hospice nurse called, I said, "Please, can you give him something to get him up out of that bed? It doesn't matter if he dies on the day, but please help him to be able to walk a few steps on his birthday and be well enough to meet his friends." So he was put back on steroids. I called on the parents of a couple of his friends. I thought it only fair to let them know the seriousness of Brian's situation, in case they had any difficulty having him in their homes in such circumstances. They were wonderful, and welcomed Brian as normal. When Brian could walk a few steps, he enjoyed having us bring him to their homes so he could carry on normally with his friends. We organised Brian's medications so that his best time of day would be around 8 o'clock at night. That way he could, hopefully, meet up with his pals. The patches he wore for pain began initially at 25 milligrams and had now increased to 175 milligrams. He started on the morphine-type tablets at 10 milligram every 6 hours, and now he could be taking 70 milligrams every 10 minutes. During his worst times, the anaesthetics were at the highest possible levels, and there were other medications too. Paul bought him a foot bath for his paining feet, but when he tried it, he said he couldn't feel the water or the bubbles. He felt no sensation. apart from pain. The steroids really helped. Brian managed to get to the pub for a little while on his 19th birthday, and all his friends came back to our house to celebrate until about 3 a.m. They were such incredible young lads. I hope their parents are proud of them. I was. When Brian was able to walk to the end of the street, the neighbours were delighted. But I was trying to figure out what to do if he started bleeding at the end of the street. Should I just let him die there? Or should I have someone help me bring him up to the house and let him die at home? I expected that he'd be frightened if he had a bleed that wouldn't stop, and he'd hate the fuss of strangers around him. I was thinking to myself that most people don't cope well at the sight of blood or death, and the people helping might prove more of a problem than a solution. I feared all sorts of bad things might happen to him. Even when I'd drop him to a neighbour's house or down to the pub so he could spend a little time with his friends, I'd be thinking that if he had a bleed there, they'd call an ambulance. But I'd be terrified that he would die in the ambulance without any of his family with him. However, I knew that I had to let him go and give him the best life I could. I couldn't project my fears onto him. Anyway, deep down, I knew that Brian would die wherever and whenever he was supposed to die. That was a consolation. I was not in charge. I just needed to get my bit right. I needed to stay strong. My colleagues at work were fabulous. The constant phone calls the first few days after he was diagnosed were hard on them and on me. I couldn't spend my time with Brian answering phone calls because I needed to project calmness and just simply be with him. So begging their forgiveness, I asked them if it would be all right to fax them when I got home from my shower at night, if there was anything to report. That way, everyone would have a first-hand account. Dial-up internet was so slow in those days. An email would have been tedious, so a brief handwritten note was quicker faxed. How many ways could they say sorry? They had no more adjectives to use, and I knew the depth of their sincerity. There were constant inquiries and offers of support. My colleague Lil baked the most beautiful double chocolate cake. To die for really rang true this time. Brian loved his food, and he enjoyed and appreciated every morsel. Then there was my family. My mum was a nun in England. Having been widowed for 15 years, she had decided when we were reared that she'd give her remaining years to God, and she joined a convent. She was 83 now. I told her how things were, but I tried to save her some of the details to make it a little easier on her. Tony, my brother in Dublin, is 2 years older than me, and is Brian's godfather. He and his wife Marion were both so supportive. They called to visit and were constantly a caring presence. Frank, my older brother, lives in Dundalk. He and his wife, Mary Rose, showed us so much empathy. They really understood what I was going through, and they prayed constantly. John's mother was praying and keeping a candle lighting in front of her picture of the Blessed Mother. His brothers, Julian, Jean and Hugh, were constantly inquiring if they could help in any way, as were their wives Margaret, Mary and Marie. Brian's school principal had by now arranged for him to be provided with a scribe for his state exams. That's a person who would write for him since he couldn't use his hands. They understood how desperately Brian didn't want to be left behind when his friends went on to college. His favourite subjects were maths and mechanical drawing, and he was hoping to qualify for a course using those skills. However, we now needed to inform his school that his illness was terminal. Having those conversations, cancelling the scribe, talking to his teachers who were so nice but shocked, not knowing what to say at the other end of the line, it all felt so unreal, a scene from a film that I would never want to watch. I had other friends from meditation groups that I go to locally. John Walsh, who brought so much wonderful Edgar Cayce information to Ireland, came from England at his own expense. John taught the Cayce way, that meditation was the number one way of achieving wellness, and he did a healing session on Brian. I'm sure it was of benefit to Brian, but I gained also, as I felt all avenues were tried, and all avenues that I could think of were tried. So many people were praying, and there were so many mass cards. The Camelot group sent him healing, as did the Merlin Gateway group and many others that heard of Brian's illness. There was the Tantra group who prayed. with Vesco, a member, sending constant emails to support me. Also, the beautiful poster of Madonna and Child that he dropped off went straight to Brian's room, a reminder of a mother who watched her son suffer and die. Everything was happening perfectly in the bigger picture that only God knew. My good friend and neighbour Catherine brought me a rose that had touched St. Therese's bones. My confirmation name is Therese, and my home is called St. Therese. Being of a very practical nature, I chose to follow the teachings of St. Therese, who had said she would spend her heaven doing good on earth. I like the idea of someone in heaven looking after us down here. It really helped to be reminded that my job was to be there for Brian during his process. However, I was acutely aware that I was not the key player, only a supporting role in the unfolding drama. I kept asking myself what I should be doing. I figured my job was to be a mother. No point in second-guessing the medical staff. I would just keep loving Brian. That's what I was put here to do. But that was not as easy as it sounds. In the morning, when he'd open his mouth and his teeth were covered in congealed blood, I wanted to cry. His gums were bleeding. There were blood blisters and ulcers on his tongue and inside his mouth. There was the ritual of giving Brian 4 different mouthwashes in a certain order, and putting a cream on the ulcers to try to keep infection at bay. He often bit his tongue when he was eating because of the numbness of his lower jaw. The blood in his gums indicated low platelets, which meant his risk of hemorrhage was higher. Then there were the bouts of bone pain, when he panted and trembled, fighting for every breath. There was the intense nerve pain in his feet mostly. When he was good at home, I tried to bring him out most days. I brought him to Kinsale one day, which was about a half an hour's drive from our home. I parked at Acton's Hotel, so he managed the few steps into the bar for a sandwich. "That was delicious," he said, as always, rubbing his hands together enthusiastically. He was so appreciative. However, the short journey each way was too much. Even though he tried to keep his feet in the air and not touch the floor of the car, still the vibrations kept him in constant pain for a day. Even in his wheelchair, when going over a joint in the flooring in the hospital, it sent shudders of pain through him. We didn't go beyond the nearby shopping centre again. However, Brian never complained. I felt very comforted and supported by the wonderful Dr. O'Brien and his palliative care team in the nearby Marymount Hospice. He refers to the service as a service without walls, explaining that we don't have 2 distinct populations, the living and the dying, that there is only the living. Our lives were enriched by being supported in pain management at home and in hospital, and we knew that hospice care was available if this became necessary. I'd phone the hospice every time Brian's pain got worse at home. By that stage I understood which type of pain needed more medication, the bone pain, the nerve damage, or general pain. Every time I spoke with the nurse, she'd assure me that she would phone me back. Always, true to her promise, within a few minutes, she would have contacted Dr. O'Brien, and she'd phone me to tell me that there was a prescription phoned in for collection right away in our local pharmacy that would help relieve Brian's pain. It was most helpful having someone to talk to about practical things relating to caring for Brian. I remember saying to Geraldine, the public health nurse, who visited every couple of days, "What am I going to do if Brian can't manage the stairs at all? I hate the thought of him being stuck in his bedroom." Brian only met his friends downstairs. When he was not able to come down, he'd cancel the visit. Geraldine showed me that 2 people could cross their arms and catch each other's hands, making a seat for Brian to sit in. And sitting down, he could put an arm around each person's shoulders, and we could then lift him downstairs. I was so relieved. It was an elegant solution. I can't explain how I got through each day. It really was only on a moment-by-moment basis. I was so distressed by the extreme pain Brian was suffering. I was so shocked and sickened by his disability. And I was really terrified, waiting, hoping he wouldn't suffer any more, yet hoping this time would go on forever. I was terrified that I could not endure the torture, the overwhelming grief of watching Brian die. How could I bury him in the dirt and face a day without him? They say there are no atheists in the war trenches. Feeling on a battlefront myself under constant bombardment, I certainly called out for help. I believe I was heard because somehow I got through each day, The last present Brian had given me was a framed picture of footprints in the sand to hang on the wall at Christmas time. You might remember how that ends. The time when you have seen only one set of footprints is when I carried you. So, I guess I was carried. On the story went, up and down, Brian in and out of hospital. Anxious to have him at home as often as we could. He was in hospital only for the duration of a particular treatment, blood transfusion or chemo. It was physically exhausting and it was torture for us all. There are no words to describe what it's like to watch the one you love endlessly, relentlessly suffering with no let up, day or night, from this terrible disease. Then there was the Russian roulette with the numbers game. Reading the low platelets count or the high white blood cell count. One or other of these crucial figures was always frightening. It was like life had a gun to my head and it went bang. But on so many occasions it was like life said, "Only joking," and the blood, platelets or chemo would revive Brian. And we were back on the roller coaster. There was definitely a deadly bullet in this gun. But was this the end? Would he die now, or would the platelets get here in time? Would the chemo have the desired effect and knock back the white cell count? Every few days now they would be bleeding. The platelet counts would drop, the white cell count would go up, or some new drama would happen that led to an increase in his pain level. Rio Milan, my boss, organised a celebration of a mass in my workplace to ask for a blessing on our family. The staff canteen had been transformed. An altar was created by draping the humble table with a beautiful cloth, candles and flowers. There were more flower arrangements on the windows. Father Aquin, a former staff member, led the congregation. Retired staff and staff from other locations all joined in prayer for us that evening. I felt so disorientated, being in a room full of concerned and sad people, all praying for me and my family. Patrick Cassidy, the managing director, made constant inquiries for updates. Usually, work is a place of business, but now I was seeing a whole other side of my colleagues, a very caring, human dimension. I kept experiencing this feeling of having stepped off the edge of the planet into some alternate reality, where I'd been busy a couple of short weeks ago with the day-to-day challenges of life. Now I was not busy. I was powerless, unequipped in my new role as bystander in the unfolding tragedy. The public health nurse, Geraldine, was so helpful and caring. She organised a hospital-type bed for home. The special mattress was a great help to stop him getting sores. The back of the bed went up, so Brian was able to sleep in the sitting position, which helped enormously when he was finding it difficult to breathe. It also bent up at the knees, so it eliminated the need for the 5 supporting pillows. She got him a sheepskin, which was soft underneath him, and little sheepskin footy slippers for his feet. They really helped. She also advised us to stock up on a supply of nappies, though we didn't need those yet. The steroids increased Brian's appetite. He was like an eating machine. He put on weight and got that bloated steroid look. He retained fluid. Sometimes his previously stick-like legs were like tree trunks. His stomach became so swollen that he couldn't bend over. Our only focus was on keeping Brian happy. He was very lucky that he was so loved by his dad and his brothers who shared the same interests. Saturdays were great. The football pools were done. They'd put a bet on the horses. And then there was the golf and the Formula 1 to watch, as well as the tennis. Vicky and I just did the caring bit, as all of this sport is a bit beyond us. We lurched along in this intense mode of being. On the surface, we were like one big happy family, all attentive to Brian's every need. We could have taken out shares in an ice cream company. We bought so many ice cream bars. But caring for Brian was such a pleasure. He was so appreciative that it was a pleasure to do the least little thing for him. One felt so much compassion for Brian, but never sorry for him. As I keep repeating, he never complained. It's hard to imagine, but he never felt sorry for himself. We could have received an Oscar nomination for the performance that we put on. You would think everything was normal if you were looking on. You'd think that it was normal for people to smile and joke, to shop and watch football matches when a family member is in pain and dying. I found it really upsetting when I bought carrots, small pizzas or other favourite food of Brian's. My mind would race on. I wondered whether or not Brian would get to eat these, or would this be the last time I'd be shopping for these items for him. More often than not, I met a neighbour or two while shopping who'd ask me about Brian, and I'd have to talk about all those things that I didn't want to think about. I would listen to well-intentioned advice, grounding me in the reality of my unhappy situation. There was no place to hide, nowhere that I could put my burden down for a minute. We were now at the end of May, and Brian had to go into hospital again. He bled a lot. There was such a smell from congealed blood which embarrassed Brian, as he was always such a spotless young man. We had to squirt air freshener every 10 minutes just to stay in his room, yet we all piled in happily every night to watch a video or a match. We could see all the black and blue patches under his skin and the blood in his mouth. We knew these facts meant his grasp on life was very tenuous. How many more times could the medical staff revive him? Coming up to the June bank holiday weekend, I was worried that blood supplies would be low. There's often an extra draw on them during a holiday period. I also thought that if there was only 1 pint of blood available, it would go to someone who might live rather than be given to my Brian. However, I knew I could marshal Brian's friends and get some donations if necessary. I checked with the local blood bank to see if they had sufficient supplies of Brian's blood group, and I was told that supplies were adequate. On the ward, Dr. Murphy took such an interest in Brian, explaining to us that he was doing everything he could to make Brian comfortable. He was most professional when speaking with us, but a nurse confided in me that he was deeply upset that he couldn't save Brian. Transfusions of 16 units of blood and 3 units of platelets saw Brian back home again on the Sunday of the holiday weekend. John was home from college in Tralee, and without a job or studies to concentrate on and a social life on hold, he doted on his brother. He offered to make Brian one of the pizza burgers that he liked. Brian, not wanting anyone fussing over him, insisted that he'd make it himself. The only way John could convince him to sit down and relax was to joke that he'd been writing down everything he had done for him since he got sick, assuring him that he'd be ticking them off against the favours he would owe him when he got better. Everyone in the kitchen at the time, especially John himself, found it really difficult not to break down in tears. A week later, we managed to get a family photo taken. We used the excuse that because John had just finished college, he'd be soon heading off somewhere to a job, and we'd need to get a photo of us all together before he left. We got together in the sitting room and Valerie took the photos. Brian wasn't very happy to be having his photo taken when he looked so poorly, but I knew they would be the last photos I would ever have of my family. It would be my remaining family after that. Brian didn't understand that John wasn't the one leaving. He himself was the one leaving. Soon afterwards, Brian got really poorly again and his sight failed. It's like when you come in on a really bright day and you can only see shadows, he explained. But you've guessed it, he never complained. Low platelet counts always led to hemorrhages. This time, it included bleeding behind his eyes. Brian was left in darkness. He was referred to the ophthalmology department, and I was so moved by the young registrar who examined Brian. I could see him fumbling and generally uncomfortable. As he told us nothing could be done, he was clearly distressed that he couldn't do more. "Are my hands clean, Mum?" Brian asked when he was washing his hands. "I can't see my hands." I'm still so moved when I hear Charlie Lansborough sing "What colour is the wind?" What colour is the wind, Daddy? Is it yellow, red or blue? When he's playing with my hair, Daddy, does he do the same to you? When he's dying, does his colour fade? Is it gentle breeze, a lighter shade? Just like his friend the sea, the wind feels blue to me. I know each colour, its shape and size. I've seen them all with my daddy's eyes. Charlie's gentle voice reminds me of the time when our child could only see the world through our eyes. It was hard watching Brian become so disabled. Medical staff were baffled that he had survived all these weeks. Every time he came home, they told me that he would not be going back to the hospital. Every time he ended up in hospital, they would say that he would not be coming home again. Yet weeks were passing. I'd stand in front of him and give him my hands, and he would try to hang on to them and pull himself up into some kind of an erect position, and then he'd flop into his wheelchair or grab his crutches or carry on walking if he thought he could. On the stairs, I'd stand a step behind him in case he'd fall. He'd hang on to the banister with both hands and try to negotiate each step one at a time, so slowly, sometimes completely bent over like an old person. He sat on a stool in the shower and I would sit outside the door in case he needed me. I was constantly thinking of the future. How could I cope? What would I need to do? And what steps could I take to see that everything was done as well as possible and with the least amount of trauma? There would be a funeral. How could I organise myself for that day? John already had a black tie. I'd need to buy ties for the boys. Oh my God, this was the first time buying 2 of something, underlining the fact that from here on in I would have only 2 boys instead of 3. I needed to buy a black dress for myself. I always wear bright summer colours, my newest dress being pink and yellow. I'd spent weeks glancing at dark clothes in the shops and had been unable to go in and purchase them, but I knew inside that I would not be able to pick out a dress after picking out a coffin. So one day when I saw a black dress inside the door of a small shop, I dashed in. It was a size too big, but I said I'd bring it home and alter it myself rather than try on other things. It was one of the many difficult tasks, bringing home the reality of life for us. Brian came into the kitchen while I was turning up the hem, but of course took no notice to me doing a bit of sewing. Those moments seemed so cruel. On a Monday at the end of June, Brian got very ill and he was in terrible pain. The hospice advised that he was on the highest doses of all medications, so the only option was to admit him to Marymount Hospice, where a bed had been available for him for some time. They would just open a line and pour constant pain relief into him. His dad asked what I couldn't. Will he ever come out? No, they told us. So, with no increase in medications, we continued to care for Brian at home. The hospice admits patients between 9 and 5 daily. By 6:30 p.m, Brian was pleading to be admitted. I felt so terribly guilty that we hadn't brought him to the hospice earlier, but we were just trying to have him at home for every possible minute. John and I agreed that we would have him at the door at 9 a.m. the following morning. But as morning came, the pain became more manageable, so we carried on at home. Later in the day, I brought Brian in as a day patient to the hospital. He was getting no ease day or night from a stomach pain, a pain he had not experienced before. He was given various medications, but there wasn't any instant solution. We called in again early on Wednesday, yet no remedy was found. However, the pain eased around 2:30 p.m. on the Wednesday afternoon, and Brian got his first couple of hours sleep at home in days. His heartbroken dad lay on the bed next to him, calling him my old Scotia, and telling him how much he loved him, never letting his guard down for a minute, never revealing his feelings of utter desolation. Brian was talking about saving up to go on holiday next year, his dad saying that would be brilliant, something to look forward to, definitely.